Buenas tardes. Saludamos especialmente a Vicerrectora de Relaciones Institucionales y Vinculación con el Medio de la Universidad de Concepción, señora Jimena Goché Marchetti. Decano de la Facultad de Ciencias Sociales, señor Bernardo Castro Ramírez. Decana de la Facultad de Arquitectura, Urbanismo y Geografía, señora Mabel Alarcón Rodríguez. Profesoras y profesores, miembros del comité organizador del Cuarto Congreso de Derecho y Sociedad de Chile, panelistas y conferencistas invitados. A todos quienes nos acompañan en esta jornada, tengan todos ustedes muy buenas tardes. En nombre del comité organizador del Cuarto Congreso de Derecho y Sociedad de Chile, les damos la bienvenida a la conferencia inaugural del evento. En esta oportunidad, el Congreso ha reunido a casi 50 panelistas de distintas universidades nacionales y extranjeras en torno a la temática Consolidación y horizontes de los estudios sociojurídicos en Chile y América Latina. Iniciaremos este bloque con un saludo de la Vicerrectora de Relaciones Institucionales y Vinculación con el Medio de nuestra Casa de Estudio, y además profesora del Departamento de Derecho Público de nuestra facultad, señora Jimena Goché Marchetti. Adelante.
Muy buenas tardes a todas y todas las personas que acompañan en esta importante actividad. Saludo de manera especial a las autoridades universitarias, académicas, académicos, estudiantes de pregrado, de posgrado, profesionales, investigadores y de manera muy especial a quienes visitan la Universidad de Concepción con ocasión de este cuarto Congreso de Derecho y Sociedad en Chile. Es un agrado para mí, en representación de la Universidad de Concepción, darles de manera formal la más cordial bienvenida a esta casa de estudios. Una universidad laica, pluralista, que fue fundada por y para la comunidad y que desde sus orígenes ha tenido un profundo compromiso ciudadano y una vocación pública. Compromiso que hoy, en pleno siglo XXI, cuando ya pasó el primer cuarto y estamos frente a tantos desafíos, con más de 100 años de historia, sigue plenamente vigente. Este Congreso, bajo el tema Consolidación y Horizonte de los Estudios Sociojurídicos en Chile y América Latina, representa una instancia de encuentro fundamental para abordar los desafíos que nos plantea la sociedad actual. Desafíos nada fáciles de identificar, con total claridad y, por supuesto, mucho menos fácil de abordar, pero que no pueden ser comprendidos ni resueltos sino desde una mirada de muchas disciplinas. Una de las grandes riquezas de este encuentro radica precisamente en la capacidad de convocar a una red de investigadoras e investigadores que desde distintas perspectivas empíricas e interdisciplinarias y desde distintas geografías analizan el derecho como un fenómeno social y no solo como un cuerpo normativo. Esta riqueza entonces sin duda dará lugar a una investigación aportará a una investigación rigurosa y pertinente para cada uno de los temas que se aborden, que sin duda es necesaria para comprender las complejidades de las interacciones entre la sociedad y el derecho. La Universidad de Concepción se siente honrada de ser anfitriona de este encuentro a través de un trabajo colaborativo de las facultades de Ciencias Jurídicas y Sociales, de Ciencias Sociales y de Arquitectura, Urbanismo y Geografía. Un espacio que refleja el espíritu cooperativo que promovemos en la institución. Por ello quiero extender un especial agradecimiento a todos los equipos académicos y profesionales que además desde distintas universidades han conformado el comité organizador de esta versión. La propia Universidad de Concepción, la Universidad de Chile, la Universidad Adolfo Ibáñez y la Universidad de O'Higgins. Su trabajo incansable, ingrato muchas veces, y la visión para llegar al programa de estos días hace posible que estemos hoy dando continuidad al trabajo del Grupo de Estudios Derecho y Sociedad de Chile en vías, esperamos, de formalización. Valoramos enormemente además la presencia de destacadas personalidades internacionales como Hilary Summerland de la Universidad de Leeds, Bettina Lange de la Universidad de Oxford, quienes con sus conferencias magistrales enriquecerán estos debates. Lo mismo agradecer a Pete Sanderson por el workshop sobre métodos cualitativos, que demostró el interés por fortalecer las herramientas de investigación en el vasto campo de las ciencias sociales, jurídicas y humanas. I would like to extend a special and warm welcome to all our international guests. It is an honor to have you today with us. Your presence and contribution are very important to this conference. And we sincerely hope that your experience here at the University of Concepción will be positive. Thank you so much for traveling to be with us. A lo largo de estos 3 días, el programa abordará una diversidad de temas de gran relevancia, desde la criminología, la sociología, el castigo, los estudios de género, identidad y derecho, hasta el análisis del impacto de la tecnología y la inteligencia artificial en el ámbito jurídico, el desarrollo de políticas sociales, movimientos sociales, hasta temas de tanto interés como el medio ambiente, la interculturalidad, los derechos de pueblos indígenas, territorios, geografías legales, acceso a la justicia y justicia transicional, entre varios otros. Este encuentro no solo es una plataforma para el intercambio de ideas, sino también demuestra la importancia que tiene la colaboración interuniversitaria, un pilar hoy día de toda la gestión que deben realizar las universidades en nuestro medio, entendiendo la vinculación con el entorno como una relación que debe ser de mutuo beneficio para co-construir soluciones posibles a los distintos problemas con una mirada sustentable. Para nuestras visitas desde otras regiones del país o desde el extranjero, les invitamos a aprovechar la estadía para conocer esta histórica ciudad. Concepción es un punto de encuentro de la historia, de la cultura y de la academia. Es una ciudad que se ha levantado una y otra vez ante muchas adversidades. Ha sido un faro para el desarrollo del sur de Chile y un espacio de vanguardia en que hemos tratado de unir conocimiento, artes y cultura. La Universidad de Concepción sigue siendo parte de ese aporte y por lo tanto les invitamos también a descubrir los rincones de este campus, que es declarado Monumento Nacional hace casi ya una década. A visitar el mural Presencia de América Latina nuevamente. Sabemos que hoy en la mañana pudieron muchos de ustedes visitarlo y a disfrutar de la rica oferta cultural y gastronómica de la ciudad. Esperamos que se lleven una impresión imborrable de esta ciudad, de nuestro país para quienes lo visitan, y reitero a nombre de la universidad un afectuoso saludo y que ojalá el espíritu colaborativo prime para seguir enriqueciendo el trabajo académico interdisciplinar. Muchas gracias.
Agradecemos el saludo de la vicerrectora. A continuación, en nombre del comité organizador, saludará el señor Pablo Fuentealba, director del Departamento de Sociología de la Universidad de Concepción.
Bueno, primero que todo, muchas gracias a todos por asistir hoy. Eh, como representante del comité organizador, estoy muy contento porque efectivamente hemos logrado desarrollar un bonito congreso, ¿ya? Han habido mesas con temas sumamente interesantes y claro, sabemos que aún nos falta muchísimo por crecer en temas en los estudios relacionados con derecho y sociedad, ¿ya? Pero poco a poco creo que hemos podido ir avanzando y esto se ha ido expresando precisamente a través de este cuarto Congreso Chileno de Derecho y Sociedad. ¿Ya? Así es que, bueno, sin más palabras, quiero dejar a la profesora Hillary para que comience su presentación que estamos esperando. Ya, muchas gracias.
Well, I'd just like to say thank you very much for all those, what I assume were nice words. And I'm so honored and pleased to be here. It's wonderful. I was in Latin America a long time ago. It's just great to come back. So, as I say, thank you. Although my primary focus in this talk is social justice lawyers in the UK, I think, it's quite clear, of course, that there's so many parallels with developments in other parts of the world, including Chile. And I've chosen to focus on social justice lawyers precisely because it was this movement that expanded the social and economic rights that were created in the post-war, Second World War world by the Keynesian policies. And it was then these social justice lawyers who have been the target of neoliberal assaults. And in this presentation, I want to argue that therefore, these assaults on them and on their clients, of course, extend beyond just assaults on them. They've come to be, certainly in the UK, an assault on the rule of law, a reconstruction of the rule of law as actually a sort of what the ministers are calling a lefty project, and ultimately a process whereby the law has been desacralized. And in the US, we see that it's gone further, and we see that it's giving rise to what's been called an impunity culture. And what, drawing on the work of Ernst Fraenkel, who theorized what happened under the Nazis, a prerogative state. So that's why I'm focusing on them. Oops, I must remember to do the slides, right. Okay, so that's really what I've just said, explaining what I'm going to be doing. So just to sketch a little of the background, as I said before, we can see social justice lawyering clearly emerging in the UK as a result of Keynesian economic policies, which were concerned to actually humanize capitalism, if you like, and to preclude, if possible, revolutionary threats. And therefore, it was grounded in a concept of citizenship which involved universal recognition and social solidarity. But what we find, of course, is that then you can understand that form of citizenship, the social citizenship that this created, as what's called a momentum project, that, it gave rise to further demands. And so we see, as we see in so many other parts of the world, in the 1960s and 1970s, the emergence of new social movements who are struggling for a post-bourgeois, post-patriarchal democratic civil society, and who are so deeply critical of the liberal institutions which continue to prevail. And I think one of the most striking things to remember for my purposes, since I'm conceptualizing this, what happens as a process of deprofessionalization, is that one of the features of these movements was their countercultural anti-professionalism, which is epitomized by Ivan Illich. So what does this result in? Well, the social justice project, which they created, was a very distinctive project which was specifically aimed to hold law and the profession up to account, if you like, and to oblige law to realize its normative dimensions, to hold it to its promise of justice. And so this results in an explicitly politicized, democratic, creative view of law. It's sometimes described as a capacious view of law, where it was stretched, existing legal norms were stretched, if you like, and a transgressive form of legal practice, which explicitly rejected law's claimed social detachment and narrow single issue focus. And so this took many forms, specifically a form of practice which was designed to empower clients, to involve them in the process, all sorts of things like the way people dressed, of course, and the forms of relationships they had with somebody like a secretary, for instance, in a firm. And that results very quickly in an extraordinarily short period of time, from the early 70s onwards to the establishment of law centers, is specifically inspired by the law center movement in the US, radical law firms, not-for-profit civil society organizations, pressure groups such as the Legal Action Group, Justice, and so on. And a burgeoning human rights discourse further feeds this drive to expand socioeconomic and political rights to hold the state to account. And because this is in chime, this is in sync really with a wider social democratic zeitgeist, you get an expanding legal aid system at the same time, which supports these policies, and also local authorities, funding, not-for-profit centers, etc. Okay, so these are just some snapshots to illustrate the large variety of causes that they were involved in. On the left, you have a celebration of the release of the Birmingham Six, who were the people who were accused of terrorism and wrongfully imprisoned, and for whom there was a lengthy campaign to prove them, to bring the evidence which made it clear that the police had been lying. The one at the top is a civil servant, Clive Ponting, who was cleared by the jury. A jury would not be able to do that now, but at that point, the jury could disobeyed the judge's instructions and held that the civil servant had a right to disclose the lies that underpinned the bombing of the Belgrano. And then you have the anti-racist attacks being demonstrated against Sarah Thornton, provocation, domestic abuse. So, you know, you saw action across a whole range of fronts in addition to, you know, expanding housing rights and so on. So, of course, as we know, this all on one level comes to a sort of juddering halt with the economic crisis, which was narrated in neoliberal discourse as caused by the bloated state. And in this narrative, welfare is depicted as antithetical to freedom. And I think that's one of the really interesting things to fasten onto, that actually, you know, it wasn't just an economic crusade, revolution, if you like. It was also about arresting Britain's moral decline as well as its economic decline, because welfare had produced this dependent, irresponsible citizenry. And so poverty becomes no longer a systemic problem, it's an individual problem, which can only be solved by responsibilizing, as they call it, the individual. Okay, so you have, in response, these neoliberal policies. And I think the complicated thing, which again, I mean, you'll be aware of, is that you know, this was a long process, and there was contestation, and certain things were changed very quickly. So the attack originally was primarily directed at the trade unions, but then other things intervened. And in fact, what's interesting is that legal aid practice and radical practice does carry on for quite a long time, especially as a result of the election of Tony Blair and a drive to include access to advice on welfare. Although, interestingly, Tony Blair continued the Thatcherite projects in other ways and was deeply hostile to lawyers. So, thinking about why I'm talking about this in terms of deprofessionalization, I think it's because, you know, obviously neoliberal policies weren't just about actually attacking the public sector and the public sector professionalism. It was also, as we know, about marketizing and ending professional monopolies. And so for the big corporate law firms, that's when you see this huge expansion, effectively the what were once independent practitioners being turned into employees, and them really benefiting and becoming hugely rich, but at the same time, you know, having more and more affinity with business and losing their distinctive professional ethos and the legitimacy that professional ethos gave them. And that obviously opens up this huge gulf in the profession. So you really can no longer talk, I would say, about one profession anymore at that point, even if you don't interrogate what's meant by profession in the first place. So Wes Pooh says, you know, really from now on, the profession is simply an agglomeration of different groups, different interests. When we look at the publicly funded sector, though, we see the explicit erosion of professional autonomy through this micromanagement of legal entities and legal practice, primarily through audit, which is part of the new public management way in which the public sector was to be disciplined. And that's underpinned by discourses of vilification and discourses which explicitly cast doubt on the professionalism of this sector. Okay, right. I mean, obviously, as I say again, this is happening in many liberal democracies. And so Margaret Summers, writing about this in the US, describes this is a war on social citizenship. And she says that the ultimate aim is actually de-democratization. And that entails this effective partitioning of citizenship, which entails in turn, of course, the poor, whole sectors of what were formerly all citizens becoming explicitly labeled as the poor, and being described, what Zygmunt Bauman describes as flawed consumers, because the mark of citizenship now is to be a consumer, and these people can't consume properly. And Saskia Sassin talks about them as devoid of value, being stigmatized as surplus populations, which ultimately, and obviously bearing in mind this is a process that's continued and is continuing across the world, huge surplus populations which have to be dealt with in some way. And originally, the way in which they're going to be responsibilized is by making social welfare rights, them ceasing to be rights and becoming conditional on all sorts of increasingly complex measures. And it also means that if the person is legally aided, they're only entitled to a minimal service because of their inherent lack of value and the inherent lack of value of the causes that they are bringing or seeking to bring to law. And anything more would give them an advantage over the more deserving private client. And obviously that therefore has a deep effect on the lawyers and the advisors who are seeking to continue with this project of empowering and giving a good service to these clients. And it means that, you know, in the discourse, legal aid is no longer access to justice, which is how, of course, it was initially framed. Although interesting, in a lot of the reforms begin with a sort of little piece saying, you know, Britain believes in access to justice and, you know, access to justice fab. But actually, the rest of the discourse really is about legal aid as a market failure, and that it's caused by rent-seeking fat cat lawyers, which actually was Tony Blair's phrase, and state-funded Rottweilers, which was a phrase deployed by a Conservative minister just before they lost the election to New Labour. A group of scholars came up with this theory of supply-induced demand, that it was lawyers, legal aid lawyers, who were actually driving this increased demand, which obviously completely flew in the face of, you know, massive increase in people's problems as poverty increased and as, you know, rights to decent housing, etc., increased. And so part of that is this transformation, of course, therefore, part of the marketization, which is the solution to the wasteful public sector, and responsibilizing organizations and individual lawyers through new public management, which means that, you know, everything they do is audited at a minute level and audited by non-lawyers. So that's the interesting thing. You know, I'd interview lawyers and they'd say, you know, I've done all this and etc. And it's knocked back by a 20-year-old civil servant who has no legal training and has never been in a room, who's been beaten very badly and is having to give advice. So another clear example of deprofessionalization. And so what we see is, you know, the transformation effectively, therefore, of legal advice from a constitutional civil right to a commodity. And that, plus the penetration of audit practices and values, distorts the sector's original ethos and form of practice, just as that original legitimating ethos, which the corporate sector also enunciated, has also effectively been eroded. Okay, so basically, you know, as time goes on, doesn't matter. As time goes on, you know, it just things get worse, if you like. You know, the policies, more policies are enacted, and the crisis deepens. And the backdrop of this, again, which we see in many countries, is an increase in executive power, an erosion, a creeping erosion of democratic norms, and of civil liberties. And so, for instance, again, under Tony Blair, creation of huge number of new criminal offences, and giving the police far stronger powers. And justice is increasingly reframed as antithetical to public interest. And that, in combination with low fees, you know, which is making these types of practice, you know, more and more unviable. And the vilification of lawyers, attacks on human rights, and growing criticism of the judiciary as well, against a backdrop of the dilapidation and the closure of courts. So, you know, judges talk about, you know, there's buckets of on the floor with water coming through the ceiling, and in more and more of a backlog in the courts because so many rooms are closed because they're not usable or there aren't enough judges. So, and obviously all this, get the backdrop to all this is that Britain still leads the world in, you know, access to justice and so on. And what at the same time you see the withdrawal or restriction of certain substantive and procedural legal rights. And I think, you know, this all has to be contextualized, doesn't it? As everywhere we see the increasing prevalence of this discourse of a nanny state, which is why we have to responsibilize people, because otherwise they are just feckless dependents. And the significance of wokeness, which becomes an increasingly popular term over the last 10 years. And I think also interesting, so many dimensions to it. So, you know, the idea of white men's victimhood, and of course, increasingly white replacement theory too, and this backlash against feminist gains. And I sort of noticed certainly that, you know, there was this moment when definitely there seemed to be a much more egalitarian atmosphere and discourse in law firms and the courts, and then increasingly all sorts of extremely misogynist, racist and sexist comments appeared to be permissible again. And I have a colleague who she collaborated on a special issue of the International Journal of the Legal Profession, on which my presentation is based. And her paper, she's a former barrister who specialized in immigration asylum. She talks about justice chauvinism. And so she very much sort of focuses on the way in which another driving factor is, if you like, the return of the empire. And I think that's another interesting thing which makes, you know, Britain distinctive, that, you know, all this, the backdrop to all of this is what Paul Gilroy, a wonderful Black scholar, says, you know, we see post-imperial melancholia infecting all this sense of decline, which unfortunately the sort of short, sharp shock of the Thatcherite policies and not being able to arrest, and instead clearly it's somebody else's fault. And you know, the sort of discourse of British exceptionalism, the significance of the earlier struggle with Argentina, the struggles with Europe are all part of this picture of this sort of absolute crisis in, I think, British identity and the British state. And going back to legal aid, this then is manifest or is accentuated by the financial crisis of 2008. And this then results in austerity. And as I say, for legal aid policy, we have what's called the Legal Aid Sentencing and Punishment of Offenders Act, LASPO, and that effectively eviscerates legal aid. And so, you know, I think towards the end of the 1970s, 1980s, Britain's legal aid system was probably the most generous in the world, certainly as generous as Norway and the Netherlands. And now it's just completely gone, really. They've had to row back on certain things because of human rights, because for the Tories, you know, unfortunately still being tied to human rights. So they've had to row back on it with regard to some domestic violence. But on the whole, legal aid is virtually gone. And it's also gone in the sense of the limited power now practitioners actually have to be able to really act. So, you know, I was doing some interviews recently, and the woman I was talking to said, well, you know, all I do now is manage expectations. You know, it's just, and another one in Manchester, I'm hopeless on population figures, but Manchester is a very, very big city, and they got about, I don't know, 30 advisors. It's just crazy. Okay, so where am I? So yes, as I say, in addition to the financial crisis, what you have is an increasing scapegoating, not just of the poor, as it was originally. Now it's the refugees and this rhetoric depicting UK as swamped. And it's interesting when you read some of the discourse around this, because actually in a lot of the right-wing tabloid press, it's narrated as, you know, we're so generous and we're so nice, and then all these people come and take advantage of us and are, etc. And are completely ignoring, of course, the fact that actually it's so difficult now for anybody to get benefits, let alone refugees. So, and as part of that, then lawyers are, you know, increasingly targeted and described as lefty, unpatriotic, and that comes up again and again. And these of course, these chauvinistic narratives also challenge legal constitutionalism. Okay, have I done this one? Have I done this one? You've probably forgotten. Okay, if you've forgotten, you shouldn't have done. I'll do it again. Anyway, so I mean, I think we can see that, you know, the fact that the government, the last Tory government, and I would say our new Labour government, has effectively been complicit in this vilification of lawyers, and the way in which they've endorsed campaigns against lawyers, and they've been reluctant to prosecute breaches of international law, and have generally neglected the justice system in the way I've described, you know, the dilapidation of the buildings, the fact that lawyers are not paid enough to actually do it. You've had strikes by barristers, you know, unheard of. It's all part of the way in which law in general is portrayed as an inauthentic expression of, and hence barrier to the will of, the culturally white people. And so legal constitutionalism should therefore no longer constrain politics. And as Walker says, law's constituent power has shifted to the people. Of course, only particular people. And that's the claim that underpinned Brexit and the whole Leave campaign, and the way in which, when there was the fight back in the Miller case, the judges who decided that, such as Brenda Hale, Lady Hale, were depicted as enemies of the people. Okay, and so this is just an example of, you know, the role of the tabloid press and the way in which these discourses continue. In fact, I mean, it's in 2025, but this has been going on for all the time I've been talking about. And it absolutely, I think, illustrates the way in which, you know, the story is that power has shifted to the lawyers, and we've got to bring back power to politicians, i.e. to the House of Commons, by which, of course, is actually meant, you know, I mean, you know, the House of Commons is increasingly, it's totally subjected to executive control. So it really wouldn't make it at all, it wouldn't make it more democratic at all. But anyway, so the next time Britain has a right-wing government, whichever party finds itself atop of the smouldering heap of ashes, so this whole discourse as well of Britain becoming just the sort of thing that Elon Musk is also arguing, that the whole place is in a total state of crisis, which it is to a degree, but not to the extent that's being said here. They could do no worse than atop its agenda with a modified line from Henry VI, let's get rid of all the lawyers. And this is just some snaps from papers talking about the hypocrisy of lefty lawyers. That's Suella Braverman, who was the Home Secretary who came up with the plan for removing asylum seekers to Rwanda. She just replaced Priti Patel, who had the same kind of policy agenda. So obviously, you know, this is actually making social justice lawyers increasingly vulnerable. And in 2020, we have this attack on a lawyer in a law firm in London. And a few days before, Home Secretary Priti Patel talking about activist lawyers frustrating the removal of migrants, Boris Johnson, then Prime Minister, saying he would stop the criminal justice system being hamstrung by what the Home Secretary would rightly call lefty human rights lawyers and other do-gooders. August 23, the Tory party send this dossier to the right-wing tabloid press in which they specifically name certain people who are then attacked. And there's this attack by Rishi Sunak's government on lefty lawyers again, who are frustrating the will of the people, namely these policies. And it's interesting, I say, the sort of discourse, you know, a left-wing blob. Okay, so then in 24, you get the riots, which you may have read about, where, you know, for 4 days, it's really very frightening. And as the Law Society says, you know, immigration lawyers are frightened about a very real frontline threat, an atmosphere of intimidation that's gone beyond this list that was being circulated of 60 immigration advice centres, which were circulating, people invited to attack them. And now, fast forward to this year, we've had the same thing, not to the same extent at the moment, but far-right organizations stirring up racist violence and trying to repeat the violence of 2024, centered around St. George's flag. And it's interesting the way in which you can read this in a way as an attempt to sort of reconstitute the nation around the flag, around a different understanding, you know, of the flag. And, you know, all the sort of rhetoric is about saving our children because all these people are paedophiles, and, you know, massive protests being whipped up. So there's an example. I think it's just stepping back, another dimension to these developments, which say I know are happening obviously in so many other places, is of course the war on terror and the development of the security state and the way in which that has in so many places justified further violations of fundamental legal principles. And so, you know, our Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, who is a human rights lawyer, and yet he has really taken a long time to ground government policies on Gaza. You know, his pronouncements originally were just extraordinary. But he has proscribed the protest group Palestine Action and puts it therefore in the same category as ISIS. But obviously we know that, you know, in the US, we see the most clearest example, don't we, of this forcing legal authority to submit to executive power, and specifically the whims of Trump. And there's many US scholars writing about that crisis in law in the US. And the way I think about this is what we've seen over the past 10, 20, 30 years is a desacralization of law. When I say that, I'm drawing on a whole literature which has made this analogy between law and religion. And so Tomaroff, anthropologist, talks about law's sacral underpinnings, born of this separation between natural law and theological law. And Derrida spoke about the mystical foundations of law, how you've got this common reliance on ritualization as a basic act underlying the creation of norms and differentiating the profane from the sacred. And so I think when you've got deprofessionalization, we're not just talking about the profession and the attack on particular lawyers. We're talking about a whole reconfiguration of law and the state. And I referred earlier to Frenkel, that he and other US scholars have increasingly used that to describe what Trump is doing, whereby you have what's called the normative state, where life carries on as usual to a degree, but then you have the prerogative state, which has effectively undercut all the dimensions of liberal constitution, legal liberalism. Okay, so my argument is deprofessionalization is a good way of thinking about this, because not only, I mean, to explore that in detail, you know, I'd have to say quite a lot about what I understand by profession and professionalism, which is an inherently abstract ideological term. But what we have seen over the last 50, 60 years is this erosion of the ideological coherence, which gave shape to the profession, which, you know, was necessary for the profession to be able to hold itself out as having these very particular values, such a especially a very specific form of ethics which justified their autonomy. And what we've seen, of course, is certainly with the social justice sector, is the subjection of lawyers to neoliberal disciplinary measures, which have eroded that professional logic, which have certainly with regard to the social justice sector, have ridiculed it and doubted it, and a specific drive to displace what Weber calls a value rationality by a calculative rationality. And that's part, as I say, of the general assault on liberal legalism and democratic norms. But what interests me is because when I was thinking about this and say going back to thinking about the profession in the first place and drawing on the work of Andrew Abbott, he talks about how that there must be homogeneity. It must be possible for the profession to be legible by the public. So you have got to have a clear archetype which can therefore hold itself out as having these particular values and which can be understood to have them by the general public. It's got to be recognized. And of course, the social justice lawyers, in a way, are the first ones to say that's a load of rubbish. We're not all the same, and we're certainly not all going to be the same when we come in, because we are going to think of law in a different way. We are going to hold law and lawyers to account. We're going to, pursue a totally different form of practice. We're going to be really respectful to our clients. We're not going to go and, wear some dark suit and make them wait and then effectively often sometimes humiliate them, etc. We're going to speak in their language. And so it's so interesting to think that, thinking about this process, I could see the way in which these lawyers, their values and their whole way of working has been, as I say, ridiculed, and they've been described as unprofessional, which has been a way of, casting doubt on their integrity. But of course, in practice, they also contributed to this transformation. And just to finish, I think the other interesting thing, I hope for you, is that this story, which obviously does have lots of parallels with other parts, but it's taking place in a society which, absolutely, talking about Benedict Anderson's concept of imagined communities, the whole way in which the British imagined themselves is through this lens of being absolutely the home of rule of law. Absolutely. So Winston Churchill talking about the House of Commons as the shrine of the world's liberties, etc. And the fact that it's tied up inextricably with the nature of English character and society. So it is inconceivable that we could end up as like Nazi Germany, because it's not part of the British character, which is absolutely inherently liberal and etc. And then, the British Empire, only recently described by a Conservative MP as the bastion of liberty, and how we invented freedom. And it is uniquely British, the creation of our political and legal institutions. And at the same time, going alongside that, we have these sorts of headlines. And now this is the Labour Home Secretary blasting lefty lawyers, pursuing exactly the same policies, the same discourse. And just 2 days ago, there have been more major threats against social justice lawyers and advisors in general of the type that I was talking about last year, with names being circulated, death threats, etc. What has the government done? Nothing. Silence. So it's rather depressing. Thank you. Yeah. You can sit down. Yeah. And then okay.
Voy a partir por acá atrás. La suerte de haberme sentado atrás me tocó. Hello. Thank you so much for this enormously informative presentation. It shows us that what is happening here in Chile is happening everywhere. Particularly in Chile, there's a range of words that some people use, like judicial activism or judicialization of problems that were designed, I believe, by the businessmen of this country, trying to or attempting to undermine judicial activity. However, the scholars are trying to make sense of these words. What is judicial activism? How to identify it? And to me, it makes no sense because these words are just a mean to attack the issue with the judges. I don't know if you agree. I don't know if it's happening on the same level in your country. I wanted to comment on that situation. Thank you.
So we'll take two more questions. So
As long as I can remember.
yeah, okay. No, if you want to answer right away, so
Well, I
yeah.
think I would like to answer really, because also that might then relate to what somebody else is going to answer. I think that's very interesting. Yes, the word activism crops up the whole time. And of course, again, I think that explicitly deprofessionalizes, because, you know, as a judge, you're not supposed to be activist. You're supposed to just obey. You are the mouthpiece of the law. Although another interesting aspect of it is that in a way it plays into when you think about the work of Philip Selznick writing about the rule of law, and the people talking about the way in this period the earlier period that I was talking about, which is a social democratic period, you do have the judges having a similarly more capacious idea of the law, if you like, which maps onto what I was saying about these lawyers. I mean, to describe it as activists, though, I think would be a step too far, and it's clearly is a way of saying, you know, you're not proper judges anymore. You say you're not professional.
It's bad. Okay.
Thank you for the presentation. I was wondering if we could think of this kind of war or struggle against lawyers, not just concentrating in action directly towards them, but maybe policies that go against groups which they work with. And basically, in some cases, I will believe, make them almost dirty workers, in a sense.
Make them
Dirty workers, dirty workers.
Dirty water. Oh, dirty workers.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, yes.
And I was thinking.
Everett Hughes.
Yeah. And I was thinking, for example, public defenders in Chile who represent foreign nationals. Changes in the migration law or the criminal law had made the work almost impossible, which obviously erode their morale. So maybe there are actions that not directly focusing on lawyers, but at the same time they are eroding their morale or affecting them.
Oh, absolutely. I think that's why it's so, you know, I mean, it's happening on so many different fronts and in so many different ways. And thinking about what you just said, there's a Scottish scholar called Mike Adler, and he is particularly focused on changes to benefits rules. And you have, you know, how the rules about how you claim and the sort of dates by when you have to claim and when you have to go for a job interview, and if you don't make it, etc. And you can end up with, if you fall foul of any of these rules, you can end up, you know, losing your benefit for a year, say. And what he is particularly interested in is the rights of appeal. And he says, you know, actually these policies, they really transgress the rule of law because they don't follow any of the principles which are supposed to underpin that. And I think that's clearly true of what's the way asylum and immigration is being dealt with. Yeah, it's, and then added to that, the fact that people just don't have the time. And sorry, another aspect, because since we're talking about, you know, the way this is, there's so many broad fronts. I was talking to somebody about what's happened with regard to judges. So picking up on your point, since the enemies of the people attack on them. And she was saying, well, you know, number one, we've really had no change in terms of diversifying or democratizing the Supreme Court since there were attempts to do it 10, 15, 20 years ago. And what's also striking is that they are increasingly just taking cases which are very safe. So when Lady Hale was there, they took a lot of human rights cases. They had some really, now, no. So, I mean, I think it's another way in which, you know, there's so many ways in which these things happen, and the way in which democratic norms are unpicked. And
hi, Hilary, and hi. And thanks for this interesting presentation. I have a short question and a comment. Regarding the question, I was wondering how the UK case that you presented could be compared to some extent to the reality and developments in the US, because at least in terms of discourse and political projects, your narrative is relatively similar to what happened in the United States in structural terms over the second part of the 20th century. So I was wondering if there is some comparative point between the reality you presented with that of the US, and what can we learn from the Global South and from Chile of those experiences regarding the legal profession and the emergence and development of social justice lawyers. So that's the question. And the comment. Yeah, the comment. To some extent, in your presentation, there is a narrative generating the deprofessionalization of social justice lawyers. Essentially, UK changed from an ideology related to social justice and democratic promises to the discourse and the ideology of neoliberalism. So I was wondering if, to some extent, neoliberalism changed the structures of the state and how professionals are incorporated into the states and tend to occupy position in the state, and how this ideology could also change the type of professionals inhabiting the state. For instance, changing lawyers from engineers or other type of professions more related to what we associate to the notion of neoliberalism. And then the cooptation of new professions in the state, changing the profile of lawyers, could also affect the professional value of the state of lawyers in general in society through struggles and in different interests of professionals within and outside the state. So my comment is that maybe there is not only neoliberalism changing and affect and generating deprofessionalization, but there is also a sort of middle level in which the ideology by itself, it's changing the type of professions we have in the state. These generate changes regarding the role of power of lawyers, and then it also affects the levels of professionalism, and in this case, it generates deprofessionalization for social justice lawyers. So those are my points.
phew.
My apologies.
Yeah,
It
absolutely.
was provocative, so I just wanted to share this, but we can talk about it.
Look, I
after
mean,
that.
okay, let's say I'm rather tired, and it's quite difficult, but I mean, just taking your last point. So I think what you're saying is, you know, there's so many levels we can see this, and can we also see it in terms of how lawyers are being changed? Yeah, of course, that's what all these things are about, isn't it? Creating a new normal. And I think what's right in this article actually I did, I was also talking about whether one should talk about proletarianization or deprofessionalization. And I think one of the interesting things about my particular group of lawyers, which is very small now, is that I applied deprofessionalization to them because on the whole, they haven't really changed. I mean, for goodness sake, of course they've changed in the sense that they have very low morale, they've had to adapt what they think they can do. As I said before, they tend to manage expectations, whereas before they would go into the courts and say, this is my arena as much as yours, I will take on the judges, etc. But having said that, the small group that are left, they have retained that initial value rationality, which is very interesting, which is why I was thinking, no, you can't really apply proletarianization because, first of all, they still are highly skilled workers, even though they don't have so much opportunity to use their skill all the time. And also, and even though they're paid so little, but also when we think about how proletarianization was applied by Charles Derber and Larson, they said, well, you can apply it to people who nominally are high skill. We can apply it in the sense of ideological proletarianization because, which is what's happened in the corporate firms, I think, that people have undergone ideological proletarianization because they can no longer, they can't stick to their values in any way. They have been transformed, they have been reconfigured. Whereas the interesting thing about this sort of group of actors, they couldn't possibly survive if they didn't retain that core belief, which isn't to say that the whole field has become, there have been many, many changes. I'm looking at a very small group which is fighting for its, I can't quite remember all the other questions you made. You want to ask me later? Yeah.
Thank you very much, Hilary. That was wonderful. Really appreciated your presentation.
Thank you. That's a wonderful comment.
It was amazing, really. I am a teacher here at another university in Concepcion. I teach human rights law, and I'm also a human rights lawyer. And I've been very impressed about what you're saying because to some extent, what you are narrating is a little bit what I have been living for the past 10 years. I would say 10 years ago, I was commanded to write human rights reports. And whenever I was commanded to do that related to migration and refugee, I was asked to incorporate really clearly the human rights violations that were happening to migrants and refugees and what should the states do to avoid that. But nowadays, I'm still commanded to write some of these reports by NGOs, but they clearly say, please don't talk about human rights. So give us some guidance on how should the state work, but please don't talk about human rights. And I can clearly see a difference in the interest, even in the civil society. So I feel very represented to what you're saying in this way. And my question is related a little bit to this as well. Do you see some hope in what you're talking about? And the reason why I'm asking this is because despite these commandments, these claims, these asks about not to talk about human rights, the feeling I think that we have is to talk even more about it and to have these behaviors that you talk about. Treat clients better, even dress differently, keep on that narrative, because we know that if it bothers the power, then there's something that is being done properly. And I can see sometimes there are some results in Scotland of these NGOs together that are incorporating the children's rights and more so. So is there some hope there? Would you see some hope somewhere else? That's mainly my question. Thank you.
I was reading, I can't remember, an American philosopher, and she was talking, saying, as a Kantian, it is my duty to hope. I didn't quite understand it because I don't know enough about Kant, but thought, but in a way, your question also depends on the personality of the person you're asking. And I happen to be a catastrophist, if you like. I do. I mean, because actually, I think I was working as a legal aid lawyer. Before that, I was a political scientist and looking at all these things. And I I'm not ascribing any great powers of foresight to me, but I was saying this is what's coming down the line. You know, it was so clear, and I think especially for a historian, that you can see certain forces leading to a particular end. But on the other hand, you know, in a way, what gives me hope actually is things like the environmental crisis and things like the fact that, you know, you're in a society, still societies which are still quite rich, like the UK and, you know, France, and you walk down the street and you're walking over people lying, you know, I just think that when things are so desperate, maybe that is something which we have to hang on to. But, you know, in the UK at the moment, I mean, we're looking at a Farage government. And if we have Nigel Farage in power, he is explicitly modeling his policies on what Trump is doing, which is absolutely desacralizing the law and de-democratizing. So it's hard to be hopeful. I find it hard to be hopeful, yeah. Sorry. But my husband always says I'm a catastrophist. You know, the sky is going to fall in. Oh, it didn't fall in today, but it will tomorrow, you know.
Here it goes. Hi, thank you for your presentation. Thrilling. I really enjoyed it. So I want to ask you something a little bit different what you said, meaning how is pro bono, or how pro bono was working in England before this attack on legal aid. I want to frame a little bit my question. Here, it was in the medical profession, medical doctors, attending people in need-based for free was usually part of the ethical legal medical profession. But doctors earned a lot of money, and so they could afford to do that. But as competition and more doctors came about, they had less space for that. And at some point, that practice completely disappeared from the medical profession, and there was no more need-based. And it was all pushed to state, basically, as a way to construct or to organize the medical profession. And so in Chile, I think we had the same thing. Lawyers used to do pro bono stuff more before it became more competitive, the market for legal services. And now the big law firms that do it, they do it for legitimation purposes, but their heart are not onto it. And that might be at work in kind of in the way to deprofessionalization, the fact that there is no more space for kind of doing that pro bono work that lawyers used to do, at least in the US case. I don't know how in England worked.
I have to, you're a little bit blurred, so I'm not quite sure I understood, but are you saying that this could return us to the values of pro bono, is that?
Yes.
Pro bono, and that would, if you like, realize the essence of what a profession is supposed to be about. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, I think it's
Yes.
as it turned more competitive, there's
Yes.
less of
Well,
that, and part of it, it's slippery.
I mean, again, you're probably talking to the wrong person, because I mean, I think what happens with Keynesian policies and the whole construction of social citizenship following the Second World War is a recognition that the servicing of people who couldn't afford a private doctor or private health services, private legal assistance, would be filled by charity, would be filled by professionals, yes, living up to their professional code. But of course it wasn't. And it also means that instead of, A, it never filled that gap, B, it meant that you didn't have people developing a real expertise, say, in the problems that people brought to them. And C, you know, it meant that the whole relationship was one of charity. And so that was the point, really, of saying, thinking about the work of T.H. Marshall, identifying these three forms of citizenship with the development of modernity and the move away from the privatization of property, but including property in oneself. That first of all, you had those liberal legal citizenship, equality before the law. Secondly, you had democratic, i.e. the extension of the franchise. And thirdly, with Keynesianism, you had social citizenship, which was saying that everybody has equal worth, they have equal dignity, and therefore they must be included in the national conversation. And one way they can be included is by being able to bring their claims to a court of law. Now that I know that's very problematic because, of course, it's like Habermas talks about this, that what we then see is the juridification of the life sphere. And so that needs a lot of modification, but I think it's still absolutely, you can't have a democratic public realm without being knowing about poor people's problems, in inverted commas, and them having equal weight. And you can only do that by having a proper access to justice legal system, which is truly democratic. So I certainly don't, and while it may be jolly good for lawyers to save their souls and do pro bono, I don't think that's the solution. Actually, I've got a PhD student at the moment who's looking at precisely pro bono in the big corporate firms in London and how it's green, what we call greenwashing. And I mean, what you find is that actually, that they really attract keen young lawyers because they want to come and practice really interesting cases, and hardly anybody can get any work in legal aid firms anymore. So they will go to the corporate firms to work, and the corporate firms know that they'll attract a lot of the best candidates if they say, oh, and you'll also be able to do some pro bono. But then it's regarded as, I did some research into this, it's regarded as a cheap form of training. You always say it's great actually, because what we get, the really keen ones, and they go and do a couple of nights at Southwark Law Centre. There's people going to Southwark Law Centre going to lose their houses, and they're going to be advised by somebody who knows virtually nothing about housing law. Because, I mean, it's like Jack Katz writing in the US years ago said, actually, poor people's problems are the most complex of all. Really, but they're understood as simple because nobody pays very much money for them. But, the complexity of social security legislation, the complexity of having to put that in the context of, it's not just talking about losing a house, you're probably talking about some issue of criminal justice, talking about something to do with substance abuse. So to think that can be solved through pro bono, it's an insult, in my view.
I have one more question since I have the mic, but I don't know if someone else. So thank you so much, Hilary, for this wonderful presentation. So one thing I was thinking when you were talking was whether we have the same sort of figure as of social justice lawyers as you describe them in Chile, because I would say that in Chile, in the history of legal aid and human rights are actually two separate histories. Legal aid went through the development of a sort of semi-welfare state, where actually it was more this very sort of bureaucratic, not sexy, not attractive kind of work performed by law students on training. And it was not really a career path, like legal aid was never a real career path. And human rights law became a thing basically during the dictatorship, but it was never really linked to the legal aid system, except in very, very few cases. I think about Nelson Caucoto, that some of you might know. He is probably the only human rights lawyer that also works in the legal aid corporation. And he actually set up a human rights office in the legal aid corporation. But it's sort of a very, very small part of, and the real human rights practice takes place in NGOs, but it was never really funded by the state. So it's like two roads that go sort of in completely different ways. And human rights lawyers don't think themselves as legal aid lawyers, because legal aid is like boring and not sexy and not. And I mean, that's just like something that I was thinking about, and how that also plays out in how we can think and what your name, sorry. yeah, Valentina was saying about how we are seeing today this effect of deprofessionalization on human rights. But my real question is, what is the effect of deprofessionalization in the right-wing lawyers or in the lawyers that are actually supporting the making of this neoliberal project and that are committed in some ways, because they are lawyers too. And to what extent these lawyers that are actually collaborating also with this project and the big corporate lawyers, to what extent this deprofessionalization affects them too or not? I don't know, like I was...
Well, I'd like to come back to your first bit of your question later on, remind me of it. But I think that's the point. Yeah, sorry. I think that was what I was trying to do in this article, which I'm saying the presentation was based on, because I begin by talking about how professionalism is a deeply contested term, and effectively it's an empty term, which, you know, is inevitably contextual, but in the sociology professions, it had these particular meanings, even if you subscribe to the idea of professionalism as a project. Nevertheless, to be a professional, you still had to have autonomy. You still had to be able to base your claim to autonomy in claims to having a special ethos. You know, you had to make the claim which would distinguish you from other occupations in order to establish you were a profession. And those claims, in a way, had to have some reality, because otherwise they didn't work. And I think what I do in the article, which I couldn't do here, is to say, when we see these big social upheavals which start with the profession sort of fracturing as a result of the new social movements, we're beginning to see that break apart. And then neoliberalism ends that idea of professionalism. So if you look at, for instance, people like John Flood or whatever, they talk about how really the corporate world now, they have more affinity with business than they have with the profession, in the sense of it having a very particular value rationality. And so it has affected the corporate sector, of course, as well. You know, arguably, they are no longer a profession. You know, I could refer you to the work of Daniel Musio, and he's a neo-institutionalist, and he does a lot of work on the big firms, showing how very quickly, as a result of the Thatcherite reforms, those firms absolutely changed overnight. They ceased to be firms whose numbers were controlled, say big firm, 20 partners, where everybody was an independent practitioner, to obviously huge businesses where most people were employees. Well, if you're an employee, you're not a professional. So they have been deprofessionalized, which is a complex, you know, there's a lot of complexity to that term, but they have been deprofessionalized in that sense, in that they no longer resemble the 19th century, early 20th century ideal of what it was to be a professional, which was part of a whole bundle of things that supported legal liberalism, which supported their distinctive place in liberal constitutions, namely a sort of sacred, autonomous, socially detached space which could mediate between civil society and business. You know, obviously that's gone. These are now business people. And so I think that's why it's an interesting to see that desacralization is a general, law is no longer, and the profession are no longer occupy this sort of mythic sacred space. So yes, it affects them just as much. Going back to what you were saying, I think that's where I can say, oh, there's so many parallels, but of course there are also lots of big differences. And so because of what I'm saying about the specific form that the post-Second War British state took, legal aid became, you know, was very, very generous. And at the time, early on, the fees that people were paid had a parity with the fees that were paid for private practitioners. And it was sexy. That's why I went into it, you know. But it was because you got, you know, like the cases we did, you know, that I showed you a snapshot, you know, really exciting cases which were absolutely cutting edge, and it was very good. and human rights, it's interesting, you're right, we were concerned with civil rights, housing, fighting people who've been wrongly imprisoned, etc. Human rights was definitely a European concept. And it was only when the Blair government we formally incorporated and had the Human Rights Act that people began to, oh yeah, I can actually formulate my claim as a human rights claim as well. And now a lot of the action, which comes under the rubric of what I'm talking about, is done by the few remaining big law firms. There's one, and it's all in the public domain, so I can talk about it. It's this firm called Lee Day, and the guy there it does call himself a human rights lawyer. And he was one of the ones who was targeted by the government and the press for 4 years. I mean, they nearly went out of business because of the cases, the litigation they've been involved in over torture, the British troops' torture of people like Abu Musa in Iraq and arising out of the Mau Mau revolts and things. So human rights now is a very big thing. And some legal aid lawyers draw on that discourse and those things. Anyway, sorry.
So I think we can close now. Yes, thank you. We're on time too. Yeah.
Bueno, finalizado el intercambio de preguntas y respuestas con el público, vamos a proceder a finalizar este encuentro. Professor Hillary, it's truly been an honor and a pleasure having you here with us. Thank you. Your presentation was exceptional. Así finalizamos la conferencia inaugural de la cuarta versión del Congreso Sociedad y Derecho en Chile, organizado